everyone. How about another round of applause for Jason Lapine and Macy's Spirit Band? And also Donna Bowie. There's also some CDs over here if anyone would like a copy of this fabulous music. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the Vice Chair of the Gimli Red River Métis Local, Gloria Thomas, who will be sharing some teachings.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. This year is a good long break for our band, who are wonderful. Let's give them another round of applause. Okay, so settle in, kids. This is the teaching part of the day. Okay, the teachings. This is the truth part of the truth and reconciliation. So if you don't know anything or much about reconciliation or residential schools, this is the teaching about this part of our history. And it is meant to just to teach you and not to shame or blame anyone. This is all part of our history. It's to be known by all of us to learn from. Can you hear me now? All right, thank you. So, residential schools were part of government-sponsored religious schools that were established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. Residential schools were created by Christian churches and Canadian government as an attempt to both educate and convert Indigenous youth and to assimilate them into Canadian society. However, the schools disrupted the lives of communities, causing long-term problems amongst Indigenous peoples. The last residential schools closed in 1996. Since then, former students have demanded reconciliation and restitution, resulting in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2007, and a formal public apology from Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2008. In total, an estimate of 115,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children attended residential schools in Canada. Residential schools have a long history in Canada. The first residential facilities were developed in New France by Catholic missionaries to provide care and schooling. However, colonial governments were unable to force Indigenous people to participate in the schools, as First Nations people were largely independent persons, and Europeans actually depended on them for economically and for military strategies for survival. The oldest continually operating residential school in Canada was the Mohawk Institution in what is now Brantford, Ontario. This began as a day school for Six Nations boys, but in 1831 it started to accept boarding students. These colonial experiences set the pattern for post-Confederation policies. Can't hear?
Can everybody please keep their voices down? Please, thank you. Please be quiet. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Okay, overall students had a negative experience at these residential schools, one that would have lasting consequences. Students were isolated and their cultures were scorned. They were removed from their homes and parents and were separated from some of their siblings as the schools were segregated according to gender. In some cases, they were forbidden to speak their first language, even in their letters home to their parents. The attempt to assimilate children began upon the arrival at the schools. Their hair was cut, in the case of boys, and they were stripped of their traditional clothing and given new uniforms. In many cases, they were also given new names. Christian missionary staff spent a lot of time and attention on Christian practices, while at the same time they criticized Indigenous spiritual traditions. Daniel Kennedy described his experience at the Lebret Residential School in his memoirs, published as Recollections of an Assiniboine Chief in 1972. In 1886, at the age of 12 years, I was lassoed, roped, and taken to the government school in Lebret. 6 months after I enrolled, I discovered to my chagrin that I had lost my name and an English name had been tagged on me in exchange. When you were brought here to this school, the interpreter told me once, for purposes of enrollment, you were asked to give your name, and when you did, the principal remarked that there were no letters in the alphabet to spell that name, and no civilized tongue that could pronounce it. We are going to civilize him, so we will give him a civilized name, and that was how you acquired this brand new name from the white men. In keeping with the promise to civilize me, they went to work and cut off my braids, which incidentally, according to Assiniboine traditional custom, was a token of mourning. The closer to the relative, the closer the cut. So after the haircut, I was wondering in silence if my mother had died, as they had cut my hair close to my scalp. I looked in the mirror to see what I looked like. A Halloween pumpkin stared back at me, and that did it. In this civilization I didn't want any part of. I ran away from the school, but I was captured and brought back. I made 2 more attempts, but with no luck. Realizing that there was no escape, I resigned myself to the task of learning the 3 R's. Now, visualize yourself what it was like for him. An Indian boy who had never seen the inside of a house. He always lived in a buffalo teepee in winter and summer. And he grew up with a bow and arrow. And now this was his new life that he had to try and get used to. It was really, really, really devastating for many, many people that went to residential schools. That's what it was like for them. Until the late 1950s, residential schools operated on a half-day system, in which students spent half the day in the classroom and the other half at work. The theory behind this was that the students would learn skills that would allow them to earn a living as adults. However, the reality was that work had more to do with running the school inexpensively than to providing the schools with vocational training. Tasks were separated by gender. Girls were responsible for housekeeping, doing the cooking, cleaning, laundry, and the sewing. Boys were involved in the carpentry, construction, general maintenance, and agricultural labor. Funding was a pressing concern in the residential school system. From the 1890s until the 1950s, the government tried constantly to shift the burden of the system onto the churches and onto the students, whose labor contributed financially to the schools. By the 1940s, it was clear to many that the half-day system had failed to provide the residential schools with adequate education and training. However, the half-day system was not eliminated until the 1950s, when more funding became available owing to a strong economy. The school day began early, usually with a bell that summoned the students to dress and attend chapel or mass. Students then performed chores, usually referred to as fatigue duties, before breakfast. Breakfast, like all meals, was Spartan and eaten quickly in a refectory or dining hall. This was followed by 3 hours of classes or a period of work before breaking for lunch. The afternoon schedule followed a similar pattern, including either classes or work, followed by more chores before supper. Time was also set aside for some recreation, usually in the afternoon or evening. Some schools had small libraries, while many schools offered organized sports as well as musical instruction, including choirs and brass bands. The evening closed with a prayer and bedtime was early. It was a highly regime system. Overall, the students received a poor education at the residential schools. This was true both in terms of academic subjects and vocational training. Students had to cope with teachers who were usually ill-prepared and curricula that was and materials derived from and reflecting from an alien culture. Lessons were taught in English or French, languages that many of the children did not speak. In the workplace, the overseers were often harsh, and the supposed training purposes of the work was limited or absent. The final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, published in 2015, outlined several undeniable conclusions about the school system. First, the federal government failed to set clear goals and standards for the education at the residential schools. Second, the curriculum at the residential schools was essentially an elementary curriculum which reflected a belief that Indigenous people were intellectually inferior. Third, the government did not develop or implement a policy regarding teaching qualifications. Fourth, the teaching staff in general were underqualified, overworked, and poorly paid. Fifth, the curriculum, which emphasized your 4 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion, was not only basic but also largely irrelevant to the students' needs, experiences, and interests. Sixth, the students left the school without the skills they needed to either succeed in their home communities or in the broader labor market. Moreover, many of them left without completing their education. In short, the education and vocational training provided by the schools was inadequate. Moreover, the students attempting to assimilate the attempted assimilation of Indigenous students left them disoriented and insecure with the feeling that they belonged neither to Indigenous nor settler society. John Tututsis, who attended the Dalmas boarding school, also known as Thunderchild School in Saskatchewan, was blunt in his assessment of the residential school system. He said, "When an Indian comes out of these places, it's like being put between 2 walls in a room and left hanging in the middle. On one side are all the things he learned from his people and their way of life that was being wiped out, and on the other side are the white man's ways which he could never fully understand since he never had the right amount of education and could not be a part of it. There he was, hanging in the middle of 2 cultures, and he is not a white man and he is not an Indian. They washed away practically everything from our minds, all the things an Indian needs to help himself, to think the way a human person should in order to survive." Many of the students had suffered some abuse at residential schools, and I won't go too deep because there are some children here that don't really need to hear this just yet. So. But there was impatience and correction often that led to excessive punishment, including physical abuse. In some cases, children were heavily beaten or chained and confined. Some of the students were, Some of the staff were sexual predators, and many students were sexually abused. And allegations of sexual abuse were brought forward by the students, parents, or staff. The response by the government and church officials was at best inadequate. The police were seldom contacted, and even if the government or church officials decided that the complaint had some merit, the response was simply to fire the perpetrator. At other times, they allowed the abuser to keep teaching. Okay, according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, at least 3,200 Indigenous children died in the overcrowded residential schools. Due to poor record keeping by the churches and federal government, it is likely that we will never know the total loss of life. However, according to the Truth and Reconciliation Chair, Justice Marie Sinclair, the number may be more than 6,000, and now it's believed to be over 9,000. Underfed and malnourished, the students were particularly vulnerable to diseases such as tuberculosis and influenza, including the Spanish flu and the epidemic of 1918 and 1919. Food was low in quality and poor in quality, in large part due to concerns about costs. Faced with limited funding, schools were instructed to observe the strictest economy in all particulars. In general, school menus seem to have been both monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. According to Basil Johnston, who attended the residential school in Spanish Ontario, he was served mush, mush, mush. Sometimes lumpy, sometimes watery, with monotonous regularity every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, he said. Moreover, research by food historian Ian Mosby revealed that students at some residential schools in the 1940s and 1950s were subjected to nutritional experiments without their consent or the consent of their parents. This included restricting some students' access to essential nutrients and dental care in order to assess the effect of improvements made to the diet of other students. Overall, the experiments do not seem to have results in any long-term benefits. Nutritional deficiencies and overcrowding led to regular outbreaks of diseases at the schools. Tuberculosis and influenza were major killers, but students were also affected by other outbreaks such as smallpox, measles, typhoid, diphtheria, pneumonia, and whooping cough. In the winter of 1925 to 27, for example, 13 children died from a combination of measles and whooping cough at the Lighton School. Louise Moyne, who attended the Coppell School in the Northwest Territories, remembers one year in the 20th century when tuberculosis was on the round page. She said, there was a death every month on the girls' side, and some of the boys went also. We were always taken to see the girls who had died. The sisters invariably had them dressed in light blue, and they always looked so peaceful and angelic. We were led to believe that their souls had gone to heaven, and this would somehow lessen the grief and sadness we felt in the loss of one of our little schoolmates. There would be a requiem mass in the chapel. We would all escort the body, which was lying in a simple handmade coffin, to the graveyard, which was located close to the Roman Catholic Church in the village. The schools could have helped children to reduce their vulnerability to tuberculosis by providing them with sanitary, well-ventilated living quarters, an adequate diet, warm clothing, and sufficient rest. Rather, the residential schools regularly failed to provide the healthy living conditions, nutritious food, sufficient clothing, and physical regime that would prevent students from getting sick in the first place and would allow those who were infected a fighting chance to recover. Okay. Indigenous students and parents resisted and protested the harsh regime in place at most of the residential schools. Some children refused to cooperate and sabotaged their operations of the kitchen or classroom, stole food and supplies, or ran away. At least 25 fires were set by students as a form of protest. The parents and political leaders protested the schools' harsh conditions and shortcomings, though their objections were mostly ignored. By the 1940s, it was obvious to both the government and the missionary bodies that the schools were ineffective, and Indigenous protests helped to secure a change in policy. In 1969, the system was taken over by the Department of Indian Affairs, ending church involvement. The government decided to phase out the schools, but this was met with resistance from the Catholic Church, which felt that segregating education was the best approach for Indigenous students. Some Indigenous communities also resisted closure of the schools, arguing either that denominational schools should remain open, or that schools should be transferred to their own control. By 1986, most schools had either been closed or turned over to local bands. 10 years later, Gordon Residential School in Comanche, Saskatchewan finally closed its doors. In May of 2021, First Nations in British Columbia hired a team of specialists to conduct ground-penetrating radar searches on the grounds of the former Kamloops Indian residential schools. They detected ground disturbances and later concluded that these were 215 possible burials at the site. In operation by the Catholic Church from 1890 to 1969, the Kamloops Indian Residential School reported having up to 500 children registered each year, according to the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation. In 2008, Truth and Reconciliation Commission was told that only 50 deaths had occurred at the institution. The school officially closed in 1978 after the federal government took over control in 1969. There have been findings using ground-penetrating technologies at few residential school sites due to the sensitive process and impact on communities. It is presumed that historical records pertaining to deaths at the institutions are flawed, due to some Catholic orders withholding statistics on the institutions. As a result, similar findings such as those in Kamloops Indian residential schools could occur in the future. Indigenous communities often often with church support and most recently government support, have been carrying out the difficult work of supporting their members with the long-term impact of residential schools, including family breakdown, violence, and aimlessness. Beginning in 1990s, the former students demanded that the government and churches publicly acknowledge their role in the schools and provide compensation for their suffering. In 2005, the federal government established a $1.9 billion compensation package for the survivors of abuse at residential schools. In 2007, the federal government and the churches that had operated the schools agreed to provide financial compensation to former students under the Residential School Settlement Agreement. On the 11th of June 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, on behalf of the Government of Canada, offered an apology to all former students of residential schools in Canada. The apology openly recognized that the assimilation policy on which the schools were established was wrong and has caused great harm and has no place in our country. The apology recognized the profoundly damaging and lasting impact that the schools had on the Indigenous culture, language, heritage, and was one of the steps that the government had taken to forge a new relationship with the Indigenous people of Canada. Harper's apology and the compensation packages offered by the federal government excluded survivors of residential schools in Newfoundland and Labrador. Since Canada did not establish or operate residential schools in that province, as Newfoundland was not a part of Canada at the time, the federal government argued that it was not responsible for compensating those former students. After survivors lost a class action lawsuit against the government, a settlement of $50 million was reached on May 2016. In May 2016. The settlement was approved by Newfoundland and Labrador Supreme Court Justice Robert Stack. On the 24th of November 2017, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau formally apologized to survivors of residential schools in Newfoundland and Labrador. In 2020, The government is also recognizing the residential school system as an event of historic significance in Canada. On June 3rd, 2021, the federal government recognized every 30th of September annually as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This day honors the survivors of residential schools as well as their families. Another commemorative day, Orange Shirt Day, is also held every year on the 30th of September. So we've amalgamated this day, as you can see. Orange Shirt Day began in 2013 and was inspired by residential school survivor Phyllis Webstad. On her first day of school, Webstad wore an orange shirt that was taken from her by school authorities and was never given back. Orange shirts are worn to commemorate all those children who had their future and their culture taken from them. In September 2021, Queen Elizabeth II commemorated Canada's first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation by saying, "I join with all Canadians on this first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation to reflect on the painful history that Indigenous peoples endured in residential schools in Canada and on the work that remains to heal and contribute to build an inclusive society." Pope Francis formally apologized for the Catholic Church's involvement in residential schools in March 2022. The Pope asked for forgiveness for the deplorable conduct of those members of the Catholic Church who were involved in the residential school system. A delegation of Indigenous peoples went to Rome to speak with the Pope. Here is and heard his historic apology in person. In July 2022, the Pope traveled to Canada and offered an apology on Canadian soil. Okay. The names and schools of the children. Oh wait, sorry. 1 second. I have to flip back. Okay. On September 30th, on September 30th, the names of 2,800 children who died in residential schools in Canada were released by the National Centre for the Truth and Reconciliation in a ceremony in Quebec. The ceremony was a culmination of years of archival research of government and church records dealing with Indigenous children in 80 schools across the country, with records going back as far as the 1890s. According to the archivists, another 1,600 children who died in residential schools remain unnamed, and researchers continue to pore over records to discover their identities. The names in schools of the children who were displayed on a huge 47-meter-long blood-red cloth banner. And Teoquahate, I say it all wrong all the time, but Teoquahate First Nation elder Dr. Barney Williams, a residential school survivor and member of Indian Residential School Survivor Committee, an advisory board or advisory body to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, believed that the ceremony was important to ensure that the children who died are not forgotten. Today is a special day not only for myself but for thousands of others like me across the country to finally bring recognition and honor to our school chums, our cousins, our nephews, and our nieces that weren't forgotten. To Elder Williams, the unveiling of the 2,800 names was a heartwarming and very emotional moment for himself and thousands of Indigenous families across Canada. My name is Gloria Thomas. Thank you for listening to the history of the residential schools in Canada and for being a part of the Arm of Gimli's Truth and Reconciliation Day gathering. Thank you so much.